Hey, welcome back. Unusual environs here. Mr. Producer is shooting me trying to do a demonstration for you all. It's going to take several of these things, but we didn't get things ready in time with the demonstration, so we're doing a regular show. But cameras and all those things are already set up here, so if you want an explanation, there it is. All right, my messy studio behind me. Enjoy. um, all right, and thank you, Lucas S. and Ro S. Ro, I know you sent me a check by mail, but I'm still going to include you here because you mentioned the videos. So thank you for those kind contributions to the cause. Um, okay, the question comes from Carlo M. Carlo's from Verona. And so forgive me, Carlo, if I don't say the name right, but here's the question. I would like to know if these statements of John Ruskin from Laws of Fesole are correct from your point of view. So we're going to look at some statements. But I hope this bee doesn't decide to get me, Mr. Producer. It could be fun. That could be more interesting than our other creatures. I would like to know if these statements of John Ruskin from Laws of Fesole are correct from your point of view. So I want to say something about that idea. I'm not here to correct anybody. There's a body of knowledge out there, and everybody is speaking the truth as he knows it and has his experience and so on and so forth. So this isn't my proposition here of doing this isn't to be argumentative. It's actually to just talk about the Boston School way of thinking about everything. And, and so it's an impressionist bent. But so that's primarily what my mission is here. However, these things are pretty important, what you're talking about, and I do talk about them from time to time. So I don't mind at all jumping into them. So let's look at the first one. In order to produce a completely representative picture of any object on a flat surface, we must outline it, color it, and shade it, says John Ruskin. Okay? In order to produce a completely representative picture of any object on a flat surface, we must outline it, color it, and shade it. Now, a completely representative picture of an object. So that's not one of those things I'm going to disagree very much with. If you're doing a picture of an object, so understand, though, but this is different from painting at the ensemble. Like take this whole room with me in it and all this sort of stuff with all this data in here. If I'm trying to do a picture of the visual impression, that's different from a picture of an object. And there is nothing wrong with this statement here, actually. In fact, most imaginative painters are painting pictures of objects. They're one after the other, and putting them together into something that they hope will hold up well as a visually true ensemble. So follow me there. So why would I dispute that? In fact, I've done some illustrations where I've done exactly that. There is a thing that we're talking about here when you talk about the Sargent murals, or not the Sargent murals, but the paintings. The painting at the Gardner Museum, which I probably should have showed here, but I'm not going to because I've showed it before in the same context. He paints without outlines. He's not simply doing outlines of objects. He's painting with a lost and found kind of a tonalist model. And the line thing is a significantly different thing. It begins to be silhouettes as opposed to line per se. So point two, question two. Well, naturally, this is Ruskin's point. Well, naturally, any clever house decorator can color, and any patient academy pupil shade, but Raphael, at his full strength, is plagued with his outline and tries half a dozen backwards and forwards before he pricks his chosen one down. Now, presumably that pricks means pokes holes in it so he can trace it onto for the fresco. Which tells you a whole lot, by the way, about why he has to do an outline drawing. He needs to have it up there on this wet plaster so he can paint into the stuff. So he's got to have his drawing all done beforehand for sure, okay? But that's a different discussion. Now, any clever house decorator can color. That, if your mission is to paint the truth in front of you, that's not a house decorator's job. It's an equally difficult job as that of drawing the sitter. So, and any patient academy pupil can shade. Well, listen to Degas saying what drawing is what happens between the contours. So between the outlines. So Degas is actually saying that shading is the thing. Well, it's certainly true that any pupil needs to study those things, the movement of light across form and all that everything that happens, the science of light on an object. But if you're saying, Mr. Ruskin, that Raphael is plagued with his outline and tries half a dozen backwards and forwards, Raphael as an imaginative painter, he's trying to get figures that will express the action. And to give it and to create a decorative design for the picture, a design for the figure that will work in his. So there's going to be a whole bunch of back and forth searching. You see what I mean? And I don't take that to mean that it has anything to do with how important it is to do outlines. So, but drawing when you're doing imaginative painting in particular. And by the way, drawing is always important, and I'll get to that in the next point. Okay. In fact, let me just get to the next point, all right? So the first condition of steady progress for every pupil, no matter what their gifts or genius, is that they should be taught to draw a calm and true outline, entirely decisive and admitting no error avoidable by patience and attention. Actually, I don't disagree even a little with Ruskin on this point. That's what I do with students. I valued, when I first got to Gamma after studying with an Impressionist, I couldn't believe what a joy it was to be able to sit there and study the contour, the outline of objects in line. It was a massively engaging thing, so fraught with wonderful data about form and everything that I always took before that to mean modeling. But the contour, I just began to realize how magnificent it is and how important it is for us as in our form. Not because of making an object necessarily, but the relationships of curves to each other and the interrelationships. When Michelangelo talks about counterpoint, he's talking about how one curve picks up another one on a body. Those sorts of things. You suddenly get this chance to just sit there online and have a party with it. But yeah, I don't disagree with Ruskin here. I do think that it's really important for people to study outline and to put lots of time into doing a really beautiful one. Okay, it is applicable to what we then do. All right, next one. Direct all your first efforts to acquire the power of drawing. An absolutely accurate outline of any object and an absolutely accurate outline of any object of real size as it appears from a distance not less than 12 feet from the eye. Now, this one is kind of interesting in that you'll frequently see that when people will give you give you lectures on how to do stuff. 12 feet from the eye, suppose I have a cast that's 12 feet tall. 12 feet from the eye isn't going to do me any good. So, and you're drawing a cast, sometimes these objects that you might be drawing are huge. So, so direct all your first efforts to acquire the power of drawing an absolutely accurate outline of any object. It's what we just said, and I agree with. But what we did with Mr. Gamma was he would have us draw in life size, and he'd have us stand back an appropriate distance so we could see the thing as a whole. And that's a very different discussion from saying 12 feet. So that's the only dispute I would have here with Ruskin. 12 feet doesn't mean anything if you have an object where you can't see the whole thing because you're too close to it. And then, of course, you have to be a good distance back, the right distance back from whatever you're drawing. So yeah, I think I'll leave that one at that. You may see more information in the quotes after this. I'll probably look at them, but I don't want to read them to you because I think you'd be bored to death. But I'm going to have Mr. Producer put them on the screen for your review at the end. I may read them, I don't know. It depends how much time we have here. All right. So, and this is now Carlos speaking again. In other places, he also suggests making extremely precise outlines with the tip of the brush as an exercise. And in another book, he writes that painters such as the Venetians and Velázquez did not produce drawings because they learned to draw from childhood with the brush. And in his opinion, using only the pencil for too long would be harmful. I don't disagree with that last part there. I don't mean to say you can use a pencil your whole life. I don't think it's going to hurt you, but to imagine that it's not going to have, or to imagine that somehow the pencil is so important, or even that outline is so important, that you sacrifice, you don't put enough painting time in, and the study of the mass and all the rest of that stuff that goes with that whole problem. I would say that's going to be problematical. So I don't disagree with him on that final point. On the other hand, if you're talking about the Venetians and Velázquez not producing drawings, they drew on their canvases. That seems to be very evident. They did drawings on their canvases. And both of them appear to have done line drawings on their canvases. Okay. Now I say that, and by the way, it looks like Tintoretto did also. There's a scraped one or an unfinished one here in at the Fog in the Boston area, in Cambridge. So he writes that painters such as Venetians and Velázquez didn't produce drawings because they learned to draw from childhood with the brush. Well, if they learned to draw from childhood with the brush, they weren't doing brush drawings. They were doing paintings. So they learned to draw, and I would just, fill in like that. But that seems to be the evidence that we have about that. So there's nothing wrong, especially if you're going to be drawing in the other way, of course. By the way, it's never anything. One of the things I would recommend is learning to draw with everything. Learn to draw with charcoal points. Learn to draw with charcoal stumps. Learn to draw with red chalk, like the Italians so much frequently. Learn to draw with the point of a brush. Why not? I would say so. Learn to draw in ink. Learn to draw in. Why not? And by the way, draw lots of lines. I don't have any dispute with Ang saying draw lots of lines. Is it about the line per se? How often does the line per se show up, even in the paintings by Ang? And Degas, who's the same kind of painter, saying it's all silhouettes is a big deal, right? But if you're going to say that point is what is a necessity, that takes away the whole Boston School thing is saying no, not so much, not so fast, right? We may use a round brush, but we're actually articulating one silhouetting mass, one mass, a line you might call it, but it's a mass creating the line and not a point. So would I say he's wrong? No, I would say that's what they did. In fact, I would say about Velázquez that it's very evident even in his two major opuses, impressionist opuses, you'd say the Los Hilandros and the Las Meninas. It seems to me in both cases, like in the dog in the foreground of the one, it looks like he's resorting back to that kind of thinking. Whereas if you look at the hand in the self-portrait, that's a mass drawing approach. And there seems to be some search for that best practice in him. But he seemed to have some sort of having it both ways. It might be one of those arguments against Mr. Gamble thinking he's the greatest of the Impressionists if he still has that hanging over him, but that's not what Gamble is referring to. Okay, and then about Ruskin, it's clear okay, now this is Paul talking, okay? So about Ruskin, it's clear he's pre-impressionist. He's talking about pictures done with other motives than painting the phenomenon of the general impression. I'm reading myself now, okay? Rather than a collection of objects. In his general thinking, while my discussion in the videos tries to clarify very different Boston School goals, okay? I'm not going to ever say to you, right and wrong, is he correct? That's what people did back then. So if you said that one must do that, I would say, of course, that's not the case. And again, I refer you to the El Jaleo by Sargent and others by him. What's the Oyster Gatherers of Calais? These aren't line drawings per se. Whereas there are other guys who work impressionistically, and I suggest to you even Sorolla appears to have an outline base in his background or in his way of working. So I just want to make a point though. In the first set, and this is where I'm just reviewing my stuff here, and you can look at this with me. But in that first set, it says a picture of an object is distinct from an impression. I'm sorry. So I already said that. But notice point B. I forgot to say this, but completely representative. Completely representative to a guy like an object being completely representative, it means it becomes the object. But the impressionist data is left out. You aren't completely representative, lacking that data. You see what I mean? So in fact, lacking the color chroma world as you see it in front of you, if you're painting a scene in front of yourself, you aren't being completely representative. So he's talking about object making per se, excluding all the data that comes then with Monet. And so I just want to make sure I covered that point sort of clearly. But just go ahead and read through this one as you're inclined to. It really clarifies, I think, the larger scope of this thing. All right. I'll look at point D finally for now and for the next question. No one disagrees painting is comprised of drawing values in color, but Ruskin's comments imply an order of application and best practices when painting the scene before you. It's inevitably different from when one is painting a set of objects, right? So Impressionism is totally different from painting a series of objects and making them all look real. Okay, so I've said that. I think I probably said enough in here, but I'm hoping you'll have this if you want it in writing and if somebody wants to get back to me. Yeah, I think I've covered all these points. The idea of the diminishing of color, I talk about that in the second point. Any decorator can color. Well, in a sense, you'd say that's kind of what Degas is. He says I'm a decorator out of a job. And Whistler is talking about the music. And I'm suggesting to you that what's happening is that Ruskin's, well, let me just read point C. Ruskin's diminishment of color and continued supposition that illustration is core rather than visual music strikes me as problematic. And as it did Whistler. It definitely, you might want to think that through for yourself. Is he correct? He's correct in what he's talking about. If you talk about painting as essentially a storytelling thing where you have to get the objects right and all that sort of stuff. But once you get to this other place where we're talking about the beauty of the relationships and how they make a really beautiful song in the abstract, that can be there in an imaginative painting. But it's not going to be your focus because you've got to make all these objects. You've got to manufacture them all with your drawings and all the rest of that. So you've heard that before. Okay, I've been through that, been through point. I thought this might be worth reviewing just for a second. This point 4 I said that clearly the basis of Gamel's instruction was the same, except for the 12 feet back. Gamel was more interested in you knowing how far to stand back and why than in putting a fixed distance on it. But all our initial work was real or life size. That's what he means by real size, which is a fairly involved discussion once you stop drawing a single object. That is when you start making a still life. Which part of the still life is actually real? So the things behind the picture plane, everything behind it is smaller. Everything in front of it is bigger than life size, bigger than real size. How does that work out for you? So that what Ruskin is saying can only apply to single objects. And even there's difficulties, but that's the best you can do. Like me standing here, you said you'd say he's going to be this size, going to be life size. But immediately, if Mr. Producer was standing behind me, he would be under life size. He couldn't be life size. Or if you went back and made him life size, I would become this monster in the foreground. I hope I'm not that to anybody. No students at any time that I know of did their figure studies at life size either, okay? So, and historically, nobody does figures life size or real size, okay? And I don't think Ruskin in any way would have been involved in anything that was like that. So that comes later in your training, though. The idea of being, is that 2 years, 3 years in that you begin to do the figure drawings? But then they wouldn't be real size. So, I get that he wants us to make them life size. I'd love to hear the rest of his rationale, and I haven't read this book in apropos of this. I'm doing this off the cuff. All right. Yeah, so the rest I've covered. Yeah, I've covered this well. All right, then I want to just finally end with this Banzi 3's thing. And as I said, I may have already said too much, but this is written. I'm just going to read Banzi's comment. Although it was only touched upon, I also liked the mention of the innocent eye and took to Google to find this quote by Ruskin. Ruskin says, the whole technical power of painting depends on our recovery of what may be called the innocence of the eye. Now, this is supposed to be in 1857, so our guys would not have had the chance to develop that thinking. So it's really nice to see. It means it was in the air way before. Yeah, I mean, right here, how old would Monet would have been? Maybe 30 at this point. I was thinking that maybe Ruskin picked it up from Monet, but maybe not. But that's a thing in the air. The whole technical power of painting depends on a recovery of what might be called the innocence of the eye. That is to say, of a sort of childish perception of these flat stains of color merely as such, without consciousness of what they signify, as a blind man would see them if he was suddenly gifted with sight. So that's really great to hear that commentary, and to whatever extent did he have some influence at that point on the discussion, or was it just simply out there? But I like to hear that coming from Ruskin. And I'll just end by saying I've never found it a pleasure to read Ruskin. I find him way too, as it were, didactic, too preachy, I guess is the right word. And I find that's silly of me to say in some ways, but I don't respond well to that. I actually do go through the materials, and of course I'll take the data wherever I can get it, the information, and I hope you will too. But Banzi Z, thank you for that. Also, of course, Carlos, thank you for those questions, and come back at me if you're inclined to. But I hope you can see that we're really sorting the difference in what I'm really saying whenever it comes to this outline attack that I sort of do. And by the way, it was described by Paul Valery as a primitive way of drawing, a way of thinking about the drawing, draw the outlines of objects. It became something very different after a while. And so people like Sargent and the Boston School guys and many, many, many others are approaching drawing from a way different point of view. So, and that's what I'm trying to talk about a lot here. I'm trying to talk about the Boston School thinking in particular. And as I've shown you the starts, go look at the other videos. You'll see starts and other things, some of my starts, some of theirs. You'll see what the difference is, how we're not doing. So even though, by the way, you might be studying outline from the very beginning and ought to be, our way of working is not based on outlines of objects and that are then colored in. Okay? So separating the one way of working from the other. The one way of working is, as I said, for those narrative type pictures, imaginative pictures where you have to make everything up. So you get models in the room even or whatever. So they're real, but so you're making that and that and that and this, and then you got to make them all the right size so they'll line up right and all that sort of stuff. That world has a lot of demands that are in the class of, well, it might be smart to outline these objects. And most guys, even Puvis and many others, are doing exactly that. So, but when you get to talking about the ensemble of the scene, when you do an El Jaleo thing like Sargent did, he's talking about thinking like like an impressionist, but he's painting an imaginative picture. So that's really fascinating how, even in doing those kinds of things, it isn't necessarily the way to go. You've heard me say this before. So, all right, I think I'm going to close out with that. Thank you again, Ro, and my dear friend Ro, and yeah, Lucas. Thank you very much, Lucas. I know you've been around too. Ro was a student of mine for some years, way back. So, but thank you all for donating, sharing, liking, and all the things you do. And I think we'll call it that. So I hope you always have a great week, and we'll see you in the next one.